A Science of Change, podcasting by Gilmore Crosby, social scientist, author, and organization development professional since 1984. Hi, it's Gil Crosby, and it's a pleasure to be with you. As I have done in past podcasts, I am going to use one of my books as a basis for this conversation, and I'm going to read from it at times, but also embellish with my own spontaneous thoughts. And I'm excited to focus this session on history. It is, after all, Black History Month, and Black history is history. It's part of the life and times of the people who have been on this continent before Europeans arrived and before slavery, and then all the way up to today. And so it's important, as you can see from the chapter, it's important that people have as accurate an understanding of history as possible. That includes looking at historical figures not as all good, nor as all bad. And so I'm going to read from the chapter called Accuracy About History, Denial is Poison in Diversity Without Dogma. There is a context to this conversation, and I've already done a podcast on the framework I created for talking about prejudice, which includes racism, but is prejudice of any sort towards any group. Certainly sexism is one of the most insidious and prevalent forms of prejudice in human history. And there are many other forms of prejudice. One of my theories in the framework, the things I assert is that any prejudice begets more prejudice. So I challenge any thinking that says that any group is better than any other group and that any group should be excluded from social change efforts, from progress. I do believe progress is possible. It's not inevitable, but I do believe it's possible. And so I am an optimist about human progress. And I also share Kurt Lewin's belief that social science, his social science, is the best hope for creating a better future for humanity. And that we have a long ways to go. We may very well wipe ourselves out before we become, if we ever become, a more rational and yet a more caring global community. So hopefully we'll get there. And objective thinking, scientific thinking, which includes challenging the hypothesis, if you hold one, that your people, your group, your gender is somehow better than other groups. That's a false hypothesis. There's no science that backs that up. It's a social construction of reality, and a particular social construction that prevents coming together. So, having said all that, you might want to listen to the first Diversity Without Dogma podcast, if you haven't yet, before you listen to this one, because I go over the framework in detail, which begins by asserting that if we want to have rational, non-polarized conversations about subjects like race, we are best off if we have a foundation like Lewinian social science. And I just gave you some examples of that. And then it's really important that we have skills, behavioral skills, so that we don't, for instance, believe all of our judgments about others. We take responsibility for our own reactions. So things like that are covered in the first session. And now I'm skipping way ahead because I wanted to get to history. So here we go. The chapter begins with the simple assertion that denial is poison. And at least one example I have of a culture that has done a really good job of not living in denial is modern Germany. I've had the great privilege and pleasure of being in Germany a couple times in the last 3 years, and I'm going back to lead a T group workshop in June of this year in the Bavarian Alps. And each town, each city has monuments. In Berlin, there's a monument that shows Jewish children preparing to board a train to a death camp. And they've also kept in Berlin walls that are full of bullet holes. They've made a conscious decision to not hide their past, but rather to make it public and to do their best to learn from it. And I pray that someday the United States can say that they are also doing the same. I think we're a long ways from that. There's a lot of denial in this country. Anyway, so my history chapter starts with early humanity and what we know about humans. And I just read a great book about this, a book that asserts things like there were large cities where there were not hierarchies. And often there were times where people created hierarchies. Like the old theory was that whenever you had a city, you had the beginning of a state. Pretty much when you start agriculture, and then you had a city start to be created through the accumulation of abundance, and then you had a state, you got into, the things that follow, like war and hierarchy. And this book shows quite clearly with archaeological evidence, which there's a plethora of it being produced even as we speak, that there's been plenty of places that had cities where there were not hierarchies. They were very egalitarian cities. And often it was also that there had been decades, maybe centuries, of a hierarchical structure that became abused. And then people overthrew it. The other thing that happened was people roamed a lot. And frankly, if they didn't like somebody who was in charge, whether they were a king or whatever they were called, they would just leave. So there was a lot of options for humans for much of history to just be mobile, pick up and go and say, to heck with this. So there was a different kind of accountability for whoever was in charge. This was all from a book called The Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity, by Graeber and Wingrove. It's a worthy read if you like to read books and if you're interested in the nature of being human. Finally, I'll say one more thing from that book. I'm pretty enthusiastic about it. They just showed that throughout time, it appears much like birth order. Okay, so in birth order, often, let's say whatever the firstborn child is like, highly responsible, the secondborn child, or maybe the third, will be the opposite of that. We get our identity from comparing ourselves with others, and we may, in a reactive way, be different, and then get our identity from being different. And apparently that was true of a lot of cultures throughout time. On the Pacific coast of the United States, today's United States, long before European colonization, up into Northern California, there were people who lived by being very frugal and absolutely did not have slaves. And this may surprise you, but in the Northwest, there was a large number of slaves. And that slavery, of course, was different than other types of slavery. really, slavery, the word slavery has been attached to a lot of arrangements throughout history. But the tribes in the Northwest also had like potlatches where the people that were at the highest rank of society would have to give back to the community by having the massive feasts and celebrations, but would also compete with the others who had that kind of ranking. And so it was a competition. And of course, the slaves would have to do all the drudgery work of preparing for the potlatches and cleaning up afterwards. But that culture was aware of the frugal culture to the south and vice versa, and they were proud of being different. They saw themselves as a better alternative, both, like the north-going Sneetches and the south-going, the Sneetches with their star bellies. If you don't know the star-bellied Sneetch story from Dr. Seuss, you ought to read it. And I know he's been criticized for his drawings of, especially, I think, Chinese and so on, but a lot of his stories have a lot of wisdom. There you go, a historical figure that's not all good and not all bad, and really a product of the time. And it's hard to put yourself into the shoes of people in that day and age, but it's easy to look back and judge them. And so whether or not one would have done the same thing at the time, we'll never know. So early humanity, here's the main thing that I wanted people to get in here. Besides the sort of egalitarian nature of early hunting and gathering, where males help take care of their young, there's all kinds of anthropological proof that there were a lot of different ways to be human, often including worship of goddesses as the fertility. Fertility was magical, and the earliest evidence we have of spiritual practices was that women were considered magical for their fertility, and many of the items that exist were representations of females. Now, clearly that changed over time in terms of conceptions of God and so on. So anyway, to make a long story short, we all started in Africa. All the scientific evidence that exists says we started in Africa, there was climate change, and people wandered. And the reason some are dark and the reason some are light is because their ancestors ended up spending a lot of time geographically in regions where they either got a lot of sunshine or they didn't. People that wandered north during a time when it was warmer then ended up staying when things got cold. And so they got pale. And that's just, one factual piece of human history. Pigmentation. And there is absolutely no scientific evidence that shows that pigmentation, skin color, in any way makes people smarter or better or anything like that. People have different cultural differences based on whether they lived where food grew year-round or they lived where they had to get their food gathered quick because winter was coming. That led to a different way of life, a different sense of time, and so on. But none of that makes a culture better or worse. So then there were people everywhere. I'm skipping a lot. And so the next thing you know, we've got, of course, Columbus. And one thing I like to point out in this book is that, some indigenous culture is just rich and deep. And so back to that last book I mentioned, one of the things that one of their hypotheses is that the Iroquois and the northern tribes on the East Coast influenced the Jesuits, who were some of the first to learn how to speak the native languages, and vice versa. The indigenous people learned to speak French, and so they had dialogue. And the idea for the Jesuits was that they were going to convince the indigenous people that the European lifestyle that was better, that they were bringing God to them, that they were bringing civilization. Well, the indigenous people looked at what they saw and said, well, you guys are a mess. Look, you bow down to a king. They had a very egalitarian social structure. They had what they considered freedom, liberty, in ways that the Europeans did not have. They certainly weren't impressed by the stories about Christianity. They were perfectly happy with their own belief systems. And so in many ways, the Jesuits lost the debate. And they even brought Native Americans back to France. And those individuals had a huge influence spreading ideas like freedom and liberty, which caught on in France. Coincidentally, perhaps, but probably not, because up until that time, Europe was not full of these ideas. Europe was in a feudal structure, a structure based on monarchy. And so the theory of that same book that I mentioned before, The Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity, is that it was actually the indigenous cultures that planted the seeds of the Enlightenment through their contact with the Jesuits. So, here we are, and I like to point out, though, that there's also a glorification of indigenous culture. Again, it's neither all good nor all bad. The Aztecs, part of the reason that 800 Spaniards under Cortez were able to defeat the Aztecs in their capital city had 200,000 people, they had an army, was because there were 370 neighboring city-states who the Aztecs had brutally ruled for, as long as anyone can remember. They were all essentially slave states. And so they didn't like the Aztecs very much, and they were excited that someone could possibly beat them, so they helped the Spaniards. And so the idea that, there's this, I've seen grids that shows indigenous culture versus Western culture, and I always laugh at that anyway, because Western culture originally was Greece, and Eastern culture was Persia. And that was the original kind of thinking that was East-West. And, really, I mean, all those concepts get overused and simplified. So there were some pretty nasty indigenous cultures, and there were also some wonderful. And, as you know, this is what gets publicized more now, and for good reason. I mean, some of it, like I have Chief Seattle's letter to the President of the United States in here, and it is an amazing letter. The President in Washington sends word that he wishes to buy our land. But how can you buy or sell the sky, the land? The idea is strange to us. If we do not own the freshness of the air and the sparkle of the water, how can you buy them? Anyway, he goes on. It's just such a beautiful letter, and it definitely reveals the indigenous thinking of Chief Seattle, at least. So, moving right along, we've got, of course, Columbus. I did so much reading when I was writing this book, and I learned a lot about how, the experience of the Pilgrims, how when they arrived, the Native Americans were already well aware of how bloodthirsty some of the Europeans had been, that they'd already experienced. They didn't hide from the Pilgrims like I was taught as a child because they were shy or anything. They hid from the Pilgrims because they were scared to death of Europeans, and they were trying to figure out how to deal with them. And but they wanted them on their side in their own battles against other Native Americans. So, it was a complicated alliance that was finally formed. And, all these stories of early U.S. history are quite amazing and deserve to be told and known in a more accurate fashion. But along came Columbus. And, of course, before the last thing I just mentioned. And Columbus was again, not all bad. I have to say that with some, I don't know, it kind of almost hurts to say it, the more I know. Not all good. He was, of course, an amazing and brave navigator. I've seen replicas of his ships. They're hardly longer than the room I'm in. It's just a standard bedroom office that I have in my home. How they sailed across the Atlantic without being sure where they were going in those 3 little ships is incredible. Unfortunately, once they got here, they were definitely on a mission for gold, above all else, but also for God in their own way of thinking about it. And they depopulated the Arawaks of Jamaica completely. There was no gold, but they believed that there were, and with Columbus looking on and ordering it, and this happened again in Haiti, Hispaniola, as it was called, where he wiped out most of the Arawaks brutally. The friendly Arawaks came out greeting them, and then were raped, murdered. Let me just read a little bit here. This is from Bartolome de las Casas, Columbus's priest on the journey, who was appalled and tried his best to stop the behavior of the Spanish under Columbus. The men under Columbus thought nothing of knifing Indians by 10s and 20s, of cutting slices off them to test the sharpness of their blades. 2 of these so-called Christians met 2 Indian boys one day, each carrying a parrot. They took the parrots and for fun beheaded the boys. Okay, under the Spaniards, now they're all just slave laborers. Husbands and wives were together only once or every 8 or 10 months, and when they met, they were so exhausted and depressed on both sides, they ceased to procreate. As for the newly born, they died early because their mothers, overworked and famished, had no milk to nurse them, and for this reason, while I was in Cuba, this is in Cuba now, 7,000 children died in 3 months. Some mothers even drowned their babies from sheer desperation. In this way, husbands died in the mines, wives died at work, and children died from lack of milk. And in a short time, this land, which was so great, so powerful and fertile, was depopulated. My eyes have seen these acts so foreign to human nature, and now I tremble as I write. Who in future generations will believe this? I myself, writing it as a knowledgeable eyewitness, can hardly believe it. So that's from Columbus's priest. He wrote on and on and on in his journal. Those are just some excerpts. But that's what happened. There was nothing good about any of that. And so I can certainly understand the indigenous reaction to Columbus, even just the thought that he was the beginning of the European colonization of the Americas, or Turtle Island. But this is worse. These details are worse. And so he's one historical figure I have a hard time paying respect to still. So then there's the whole myth of the United States of America and how we started. And certainly as a child, I was taught that it was because of high ideals, religious persecution in Europe, a desire for democracy, for a different kind of government, for freedom. Well, the Virginia colony, there was some truth to that with the Pilgrims. They're complicated because they too ended up at war with the indigenous population and expanding and brutally taking over the territory. But the Virginia Company arrived with one purpose, and that was to make money for the King of England. They brought with them their class structure. They had no interest in democracy. That would have seemed absurd to them, dangerous even. They brought with them Irish indentured servants who they could beat, rape, and kill, maim, without any repercussions. It was legal. It was all legal. They had finally conquered the Irish just in prior time and had taken all the land and sentenced many of the Irish to be foot soldiers in the military overseas for the British. It was a brutal conquest of Ireland. It helps me understand why there's been conflict there in through the centuries. But that's what was established in Virginia. The ruling class was brutal, and there's no getting around it. Okay, and this was because there had been a history in England where, for a time, it had been good for farmers, small farmers, like in 1200, 1300. I'm just picking those dates out of the top of my head right now, so don't hold me to them. But back in the day, there were common lands, the commons, and so people shared them, and there was a time of relative prosperity for the lower classes. The upper classes kept taking the land. And so they kept reducing the farmland that was available to the poorer people and making them poorer. And eventually there were revolts. There were centuries of revolts. So the revolt was, there was revolts all over England. And so finally, Sir Francis Bacon and the legislature came up with the despicable plan of dividing and conquer. That's where divide and conquer comes from. Let's create a buffer class of people that are right now desperate and poor, and we'll give them jobs like police. We'll make them police officers. We'll make them institution managers. If you watch Oliver Twist, the orphanage, the people that run the orphanages, the people that run the poorhouses, you've got a whole class there that was created to control the rest of the poor people. And it worked. They managed to quell the rebellions in England and continue to abuse their power. But now there were people in between who were dealing with the conflict that occurred when there were rebellions, and so it was all very legal. And so that's what they brought to the United States, to the Americas, to the Virginia colony, and they started out just creating a system that was nothing but slavery for the Irish that were brought. And they started incorporated, as is famously known, 1619, the first shipment of African slaves arrived, which was, greeted by the ruling class as a good thing. And what happened was the poor blacks and the poor whites identified with each other, and they started rising up, and to the point where there was Bacon's Rebellion. And Bacon's Rebellion almost wiped out the ruling classes. They took over West Point. They took over the armory. They burned the government buildings, and they scared the heck out of the ruling class people that they didn't kill. And so the British brought in troops. It wasn't that easy in those days. They had to sail across the Atlantic, but they brought in a whole bunch of troops. They crushed the rebellion. The guy Bacon, not Sir Francis Bacon, unrelated, had died also, and that hurt the rebellion. He died of I think it was flu or something. And once they crushed that rebellion and reestablished control, they gathered and said, boy, we need something like we've got in England. We need to divide and conquer. And that is when, for the first time in history, right here in the U.S., the word white was written into law, and the buffer class was created. The poor whites who had been slaves, indentured servants, were given the opportunity to now lord it over the poor blacks who were slaves. And so, whereas, here's the official proclamation, 1691, posted on all the churches and government buildings, whereas many times Negroes, mulattoes, and other slaves unlawfully absent themselves from their masters' and mistresses' servants, a terrible crime, and lie hid and lurk in obscure places, killing hogs and committing other injuries to the inhabitants of this dominion, for the remedy whereof, for the future, be it enacted, that government people can, if they see these Negroes, mulattoes, or other slaves lying about, they can shoot them. They can kill them. And so they did. So they started to turn the poor whites against the poor blacks. And it wasn't too long after that throughout the South, every white person had guns. And for good reason, because blacks kept rising up. That way, prior to the Civil War, there were tons of rebellions, slave rebellions. Again, scaring the new ruling classes, which included the buffer class of overseers and poor whites who were always in a social position of being better than the poor blacks. And so a lot of those people, unfortunately, bought into it. They bought into it all the way back in 1691, enough that it started a new system, an evil system, that led to the spreading, along with around that same time, they had, prior to that, realized that tobacco was going to make a lot of money. And so they had, both the potential for wealth and the labor to exploit, and they created a structure, a legal structure, that was perhaps the worst institutional racism in history, especially when you consider that it fueled the African slave trade in a new way that was unprecedented. So all of a sudden there was plenty of demand. So that's, the history of the U.S. We started out, what I'm realizing as I think about this even more, is we started out with authoritarianism being a very strong tendency in this country, institutionalized. And so there was always a conflict between the tendency towards authoritarianism and the tendency towards democracy. And we are still fighting that battle today. It's never been resolved. We've certainly never come to grips with what are we about. We fantasized that we were about democracy while we went through our post-World War II period of being able to do whatever we wanted all around the world, pretty much. And a lot of it was pretty undemocratic. You just take the Shah of Iran, for instance. The first duly elected president of Iran, the CIA, removed and installed the Shah because they were afraid the president-elect was leaning too far left. So instead of having Iran be a country with a democracy, we're the ones that turned it into a country with a totalitarian state. And, how's that worked out? Anyway, this is stuff that has been going on all the way back in our history. And so the words white that are written into this were especially about white women. If a white woman intermarries with a Negro, mulatto, or Indian, they were then to be taken as wards of the church. And their children were wards of the church, and they had to pay fines, and their children would be wards of the church until they were 30. It was a pretty brutal system. So they were really worried about not just intermarrying, but the collaboration between poor blacks and whites, and they pretty successfully stamped it out. And so there you go, the history of racism in this country as an institution. It goes right back to the Virginia colony. So that's a lot of what I wanted to cover. I have a section here called An Attempt at a More Accurate Look at the U.S. and Slavery. And, because the British, they had a different type of slavery. It wasn't good. But blacks could become a small number of them. And this was sort of part of the plan to control the population. but they could become landowners. They could become educated. There weren't restrictions. They had some upward mobility in the British Empire and the French Empire and the Spanish. But in the U.S., in Virginia, they said, no, you cannot, blacks cannot own land. Even if they own it now, we're taking it from them. And there were black landowners in Virginia who were robbed by these changes. They cannot be educated. It's illegal, and so on. I mean, it was the worst version of a bad institution. And so then I write in this book some about the slave ships. And, if you don't know, you should. Let me just read a short thing here. This is from an eyewitness at the end of the 17th century on the Gold Coast. As the slaves came down to Fida from the inland country, they are put into a booth or prison near the beach. And when the Europeans are to receive them, they are brought into a large plain where the ship's surgeons examine every part of every one of them to the smallest member, men and women being stark naked. Such as are allowed good and sound are set on one side, marked on the breast with a red-hot iron, imprinting the mark of the French, English, or Dutch companies. The branded slaves after this are returned to their former booths where they await shipment, sometimes 10 to 15 days. Then they were packed aboard the slave ships, in spaces not much bigger than coffins, chained together in the dark, wet slime at the ship's bottom, choking in the stench of their own excrement. That's what humans did to humans. I mean, this was bad. There had been slavery throughout history, and if you were a slave in Egypt working on the pyramids, there's a good chance you got crushed by granite. I mean, it wasn't it was an unfortunate fate. And so it's not like there wasn't bad slavery before, but this business of shipping people across the Atlantic was some of the most inhumane treatment of anyone in history, certainly. And then once they got here, it wasn't much better. And so, part of the history of racism then, of institutional racism in this country. And, by the way, I live in Wilmington, Delaware, and the mills were a big part of the wealth of this area early on, textile mills, and the textile was southern cotton from the slave states. It was cheap, and the northern economy boomed because of the southern economy. There was an intimate relationship between the North and the South. And that's part of the reason the institution of slavery was allowed or tolerated by the North. There were voices against it, of course, strong voices, but there were also plenty of people that supported the idea, just like there were plenty of people in the U.S. before World War II, before we were attacked by the Japanese, up until that time, that were very much in favor of Hitler, making Germany great again. He was a strong leader. Our totalitarian streak has never gone away. It's still there, and it may tear apart our democracy if we don't recognize it and make a clear stand for what we value in this country. So, anyway, here we go. The Great Compromise, the Continental Congress in 1789. The northern states had larger populations. They wanted influence based on that. The South, with smaller population, wanted influence to be equal between states. They also wanted slaves to be included in their census, even though, of course, they were not citizens. The solution was the division of the government into the two chambers of the House based on population and the Senate, where each state plays an equal role. This is how we got this bicameral mess that we're now is pretty much stagnated or stalemated. What is astonishing was the further compromise that even though they had absolutely no rights whatsoever as human beings, each slave would be counted as 3/5 of a person to the census, so as to swell the number of representatives designated from the slave-holding states. So they got to have more representatives in Congress because they owned slaves, even though, of course, the slaves had no vote. I think I'm going to stop here in a minute. I mean, there's a lot of detail in here. I'm only part way into this chapter. You've got things like the Americans, an early psychologist. Now, the American Psychological Association recently issued, I've got this written here, an apology to people of color for APA's role in promoting, perpetuating, and failing to challenge racism, racial discrimination, and human hierarchy in U.S., which is good. It's good that they're saying that. However, they don't mention Dr. Samuel Cartwright that I've seen, and maybe they have by now. His psychology. Now, he's a doctor, and he wasn't specifically a psychologist, but he wrote in 1851 a book called Diseases and Peculiarities of the Negro Race, which was a very popular book in the South. And according to Cartwright, slaves who tried to escape slavery had drapetomania, a mental illness, and the cure was to cut off their big toes. This was medical thinking. His theory, if treated kindly, well fed and clothed, this is Dr. Cartwright, with fuel enough to keep a small fire burning all night, separated into families, each family having its own house, not permitted to run about at night to visit their neighbors, to receive visits, or use intoxicating liquors, and not overworked or exposed too much to the weather, they are very easily governed, more so than any other people in the world. When all this is done, if any one or more of them at any time are inclined to raise their heads to a level with their master or overseer, humanity and their own good require that they should be punished until they fall into that submissive state which it was intended for them to occupy in all after time, when their progenitor received the name of Canaan, or submissive knee-bender. So here he's bringing in, of course, the Bible to help the slaves understand the importance of being docile, and that they're from the son who was cursed to have all of his offspring be slaves, servants or slaves. His name will come to me. They have only to be kept in that state and treated like children, with care, kindness, attention, and humanity, to prevent and cure them from running away. However, if you don't whip the devil out of them, that's one of the things he says, then they may start they'll start to act up, and they'll become sulky and dissatisfied. And that's a fault of the overseers for not being stern enough. Anyway, this was very popular stuff in the South. It made the whole thing sound scientific. As there has been attempts throughout time to come up with science that proves that one race is better than another. It was eugenics in the 1900s, which really emerged in the United States, saying that the Caucasian race was superior, and that we have to do things like keep the black race and other suspect races like the Italians and the Irish and people from Eastern Europe from repopulating. They should be sterilized, so that, as should people who have mental illness or any other infirmity, sterilized in order to keep the blood of the general population pure. And that became a very popular message with the Nazis in Germany. They really were excited about the scientific perspective that emerged from the United States about racial purity. And you know how that went. So racism has been part of U.S. history. If you don't know that, then read my book, or find it. Just go to a library and look it up. I mean, there's so much information and evidence, and there's been a lot of good, of course, in this country. And so one thing I also do is get to people like an attempt at a more accurate look at some historical figures. That's coming up here. And so that included, of course, people like Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson had a long sexual relationship with a slave. Now, some people say that just constitutes rape automatically because it was a master-slave relationship, and that there's no way to look at that in any other light. And others say that that's a bunch of nonsense, that Thomas Jefferson was an enlightened figure who helped create freedom and democracy in this country through his thinking and writing and his presidency, his actions. And I say, as I do throughout this book, well, it's both things are true. Now, I don't claim to know the nature of the relationship with him and Sally Hemings, I believe her name was, because it's just not documented. And it's complicated. I mean, it's possible that Sally Hemings and Jefferson were in love. I don't know that. And it's possible that she hated every minute of being with him. And so it's possible that it really was nothing but rape. But it's also possible that it was a lot more than that. And yes, of course, if she had had choices, if she wasn't a slave, would they have been together? Probably not. I mean, they may not even have known each other. So I just believe that if we say, okay, this is all bad, so we just have to shove it out of sight, or if we say it's all good and defend it, we're making a mistake. We just can't move forward together with that kind of polarized thinking from the left or the right. So that's my thesis. I'm sticking to it, so far at least. I put together a chart, the good, the ambiguous, and the ugly, about various people, including Jefferson and Washington, and Abraham Lincoln, who ordered the largest mass execution in U.S. history, sending 38 Dakota Indians to the gallows in 1862, and oversaw the removal of the Sioux and Winnebago from their lands in Minnesota. And so, that's ugly stuff. That's where I put in the ugly column. Criminal use of institutional power from a man that I greatly admire. And I still greatly admire. And so there you go. There's no all good, all bad. I also go on to write about the U.S. post-slavery. And my goodness, if you don't know more about the Reconstruction period, when I think it was South Carolina, where the legislature was mostly black, duly elected black members made up the government of South Carolina for a brief period of time until the Ku Klux Klan reemerged and lynched them all, basically. And then Grant, who was not being supported by the businessmen, in particular of the North, sent troops back in, and in one of the great moments of our country, he crushed the KKK, the original KKK, which was Southern soldiers that he had allowed to go home with their horses and their weapons in an attempt at reconciliation, to begin reconciliation. And we all know how that went. So anyway, they start riding around killing and murdering, and then things almost completely returned to the way they were, and then Grant went down and reestablished martial law, and then they again had voting and democracy and blacks in new positions, and then eventually, especially once Grant was out of office, the next president just didn't give a crap. And so the North just let the South do whatever they wanted, and they went right back to, through violence, controlling the black population with extreme institutional racism, to the point where they instituted laws like they made it so no blacks had a job, and if they didn't have a job, they made laws about loitering. And so if you were a man who didn't have a job, you were loitering, and then they arrested you and put you into mine pits where you would never come out. It's almost hard to believe, but it's true. It was worse. I'd have to say it was worse than slavery on the cotton farms. These were in like 1900. Men being forced into mines and worked until they died, and then being thrown into mass graves. And that helped produce the ore that fueled the U.S. steel industry. then there was, of course, segregation, and it just goes on and on. And so then there's stuff right up to the present. Well, the PPP loans recently, if you were black and you went in to ask for a PPP loan, you were turned down by a wide margin, whereas if you were white, you almost automatically got it. And it was no risk to the bankers. It was completely backed up by the U.S. government. There was no risk. And yet blacks were turned down in droves until many of them were able to get PPP loans by using online banking services where people didn't know they were black, where the system didn't know. The interstate highway system, it was intentionally used by white governments throughout the United States. The funding was used to destroy black neighborhoods, especially prosperous black neighborhoods. There was an area in LA where blacks had successfully fought a civil rights case about their right to own their homes. And the same community, which included Hollywood stars, the woman who was in Gone with the Wind, that played a maid, some of the most prominent blacks of the time, the LA City Council decided to run the freeway right through their mansions, right through their homes, right through the neighborhood, destroy the neighborhood. And decisions like that were made throughout the country, where the freeway would be routed all around white sections and then plunged right through black sections on purpose. Just awful use of public funds. Okay, the GI Bill. After World War II, GIs that were white were able to go buy homes. And home ownership is the most clear path for the middle class in this country to increase their wealth and their generational wealth. And so the GI Bill was huge, and the black GIs that fought for us in World War II were not given those loans for homes. And they also were only given money to go to college if they went to a black college, and there weren't very many black colleges. And so they were essentially cut out of all of that government money that was handed to white people following the Second World War. So those are just examples of the uneven playing field in recent time. And it's still going on today. So one of the most important lessons that I think comes from Diversity Without Dogma from Lewinian social science is that we have to take action. We don't have to insight about your own bias. That's fine. But that's what a lot of the work gets done on right now around diversity, DEI trainings, insight about bias, and telling people that they're racist and so on. And Lewin clearly established that if you lecture people and they don't like the lecture, they're going to walk away still thinking what they thought in the first place and just thinking that you're a jerk and that they've been mistreated, and they'll be more reactive than ever. And yet that is how a fairly large portion of DEI work gets done. Instead, if people work together to address institutional issues, such as whether their lender is really a fair lender, and that they can prove that they really have a monitoring system in place that assures that, or anything in your own institution where you work, working together to address issues like that, even if you do have some prejudice, helps people overcome prejudice. Working together with people who are different than you helps you relate for the most part. It's not guaranteed, but it's more likely that you'll come together if you work together on issues that matter, issues of social justice. So that's what I highly recommend, that you figure out how to do and that you get involved, because we have not created equality in this country yet. And until we do, there's going to be tension, And the tension is bad for all of us. It makes us all into paranoid, defensive people, irritable. It's not good. And we could collaborate and create more prosperity for everybody. I have great faith in that. We don't have to maintain the affluence of one group by holding down another. That's a myth. So at least that's the conclusion I've come to as I've really studied this stuff. I'm not saying I'm perfect, and there's a lot of other people that are doing deep thinking on this. But that is, in the essence, my lecture today, based on Chapter 5 of Diversity Without Dogma. Thanks for listening, and I look forward to talking to you again in the near future. Take care. Hey, I appreciate you listening. This, again, is Gil Crosby, and I want you to take advantage of what's available to you. I have many free materials. I am happy to talk to people about their situations, especially if you're trying to create change, either social change or organization change. We have frequent workshops that are available, T group workshops. If you have never been in a T group with us, then don't miss it in your life. Many people have said to me, of all the trainings I've ever received, I got this one 30 years ago, and it's the only one that stuck with me. You're learning from your actual interactions with the other participants and with the faculty. The faculty are walking the same talk that they're teaching of behavioral skills. It's a training workshop. That's what the T stands for. This is done in the spirit of the creation of T groups by Kurt Lewin and his associates. It's for groups. It's for teams. That's how it was originally designed. It is a opportunity to learn about theory and put it directly into practice. Again, the original design, you learn things and then you put them into practice. It was not just all ambiguity, which is how some T groups, most are led today, where the faculty hardly says anything. That's not how this is designed. So join us for that. There's always workshops. There's the Leadership Institute of Seattle, which has certificate programs, a two-year program where you will learn from T groups and learn how to do all the organization development work that my father designed, most of it, and I continue that practice alongside my brother Chris and many other associates. So don't be a stranger. There's a lot going on. It's always changing. So be in touch, and it's on the website, crosbyod.com. I look forward to working with you in your organization or as you pursue things like reducing gun violence and decreasing racism in our society. Whatever your goals are, the social science of Kurt Lewin guides how to achieve those goals in a reliable way. And so that's what I apply and practice every day and invite you to.